The second tome of Forgotten Tales is also the second tome in the history of Middle Earth. In Poland, we have already four tomes, and I think in English-speaking countries you have all tomes and published maybe several years ago. And of course, the history of Middle Earth is prepared by son of Tolkien, son of Ronald Requiel Tolkien, the famous writer of fantasy, and it was written by his son Christopher, which also, for example, published very famous and very important book about Tolkien world, Silmarillion, because Silmarillion tells us the story of old days. So the story of creating the world, the Arda, and the creating the gods of Arda, Ainurs, by Ilúvatar, the main god, and also the main villain Melkor, Morgoth, fighting with the elves in First Age. So the second tome of Lost Tales or Forgotten Tales is about elves fighting with Melkor in Beleriand, the region of Middle Earth, who was then destroyed during War of the Wrath. And the second tome of Forgotten Tales is about also humans helping elves, and it includes the stories, the famous stories of this era. So, for example, the story of Luthien and Beren, the story of Glamrung and Húrin and Húrin family, and of course of Nagulurfang, or the necklace of King Thingol. So and the destruction of famous elven city Gondolin. So this is where the first scripts or the first notes of Tolkien were prepared to show us the fight between elves, humans, and Melkor, Morgoth in first age of our generation of Arda world, because before the first era of sun and moon there were the eras of the trees, and we also and they were told in earlier episode, in first episode of Lost Tales. But here we have this uh, maybe the most interesting part is that these stories who are told by the son of Tolkien were developing very long by Tolkien himself. They were developing even before the Second World War, and some of them even during the First World War. Because Silmarillion was published after Tolkien's death. Tolkien died in, I think, 1972 or 3, and Silmarillion was published in 1976. So by his son Christopher. And here we can see that the Silmarillion was a very well prepared and developed story of what happened at the beginning of the Arda, how it was created, how the sun and moon were created, how the big lanterns were created, the great trees, and how the Valar fight with Melkor, and then the famous war about the Silmarils, a great gems forged by Feanor, also very famous elf. And in this second part of Lost Tales, we are shown the the earliest versions of these stories, and they are very crude, sometimes rather silly. For example, in one of the stories at the beginning, in first age, Sauron, so the main lieutenant of Morgoth, is shown and depicted as big fat cat Tevillo. So yeah, so it's sometimes it's even silly and unbelievable. Then in Silmarillion the story is much more well developed, much more well written. These first stories are sometimes really crude, sometimes even to the point of silliness and stupidity. Also, for a very long time, elves in Tolkien stories were more like sprites, like these little sprite ghosts who are almost invisible to other races. And then, after rethinking some things, elves were created as much more better in almost any way human beings, almost like humans, only with pointy ears and beautifulness and not dying. But other than that, they were like, almost like humans. But in these first versions, they were even called gnomes. I don't know why, because gnomes are a completely different race and with completely different look. But in this first stage, Tolkien sometimes called elves gnomes, especially elves of Noldor origin, because we have these three main Noldor elf tribes: Noldor, Vanyar, and Teleri. So for and because for who this book is really, and I think for everyone, and especially for those who love fantasy genre, for those who, for example, written or watched Frozen Throne, or watched or are watching now second season of Rings of Power. For those who love fantasy genre, this history of Middle Earth is showing us how the main writer who really invented fantasy fantasy literature is thinking how to navigate through all these stories, and how they were all very often confusing and not having much common with each other. And then only in Silmarillion we see this really polished, well developed version of Tolkien stories. So the second tome of History of Middle Earth is about the fighting in Beleriand with Melkor, with his different stories about heroes of the First Age. And we must remember that there was some fan told that when he was reading Silmarillion, he was reading almost like an Old Testament. And I think it's a very fair comparison. Then Silmarillion is like reading about these old tales, about these old stories who are long gone, and it passed several thousand years after we see the Lord of the Rings, because the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits are in the let's say last century of Third Age, and the stories in Silmarillion, for example, those in Beleriand, are in the first stage of Sun and Moon. So like 6,000 and even 6,000 and 500 years before the events of Lord of the Rings. And especially because I think right now it's a lecture also important for those who watch all those movies, uh, because we will see an animated movie about Helm's Deep, how Helm's Deep was created in Rohan, and also we will have the story of Gollum's hunt, how Gandalf and Aragorn were hunting for Gollum. So this history of Middle Earth is, I think, crucial to understand the fantasy genre as a whole, but also the ideas of Tolkien. So for I think it's a very interesting book and very almost I don't have the word in Polish. In Polish, it's almost obowiązkowa. It's almost necessary to read this book for all those who love Tolkien and love fantasy genre. Let me know in the comments what do you think about the second tome of History of Middle Earth.